Hello, everybody. Sorry about starting late today. We're starting at 10:04. Originally, Megan and I were both going to be presenting on this, but we were having technical issues with Facebook Live. So yet again, this is going to be another Facebook Live monologue. Again, my name is Kayleen Heaton. I'm one of the professional development specialists for the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. And today what I'm going to be focusing on is the financial aid process. But this Facebook Live is going to be focused specifically on what our students that are juniors or, our students that are going to be rising seniors need to know about financial aid, because junior year can be really crucial, especially because senior year is so jam-packed, just the timeline with everything that needs to get done. You have in the very beginning of your senior year, you're going to be working on your college applications, and then you have the October 1st date for the FAFSA and the alternative application when they open. And so it's a lot that comes at you really quick for senior year. So the best way to prepare for that is by having a good backing and a good understanding of what financial aid is while you are a junior, so that once you get into your senior year, you can kind of make your plans, you can have everything in a row so that you kind of have a game plan for how you're going to attack senior year. So juniors, this one is for you today. So if you are a junior, there are some things that you need to know about financial aid. The first thing that I think is really important for students to know is that financial aid comes in many forms. So there's two real big categories of financial aid. You have your gift aid, which, as the name implies, gift aid, this is the type of financial aid that all students should be striving to get, because this is financial aid. Once you've been awarded this, there's nothing else you need to do. This is free money. So once you've done the work to get awarded gift aid, this is money that you don't have to pay back, or you don't have to do anything additional to earn. Then there's another broad category of aid, which is called self-help aid. So with self-help aid, this is financial aid that you either have to borrow. So that would be things like loans, where you take out a lump sum up front, but then you're responsible for paying that amount back in full down the road, or work study. So with work study, if you get awarded work study, what that means is they'll say, hey, you've been awarded X amount in work study, so say $4,000 of federal work study funds. In order to actually get those funds, though, you have to apply for a federal work study position, and you have to work, and you will get paid out those funds in the form of a paycheck. So federal work study and loans, that's going to be considered that self-help aid, because there's some stuff involved that you have to do. You either have to pay that money back down the road, or you have to work to actually earn those funds. And then gift aid, on the other hand, that typically comes in the form of grants and scholarship. When we're talking about grants, typically grants are going to be given off based off of some type of need. So typically grants are given based off of financial need. So if you have some type of demonstrated financial need, so you have you either completed the FAFSA or the alternative application, and it was determined that you have some financial need, you might be awarded a grant. Whereas scholarships, on the other hand, that doesn't have really much to do with financial needs. Scholarships are what we call merit-based. Scholarships can be awarded based on a whole variety of things. Scholarships can be awarded for things like, writing an essay or submitting a piece of artwork, or entering in a sweepstakes. Scholarships can also be given for athletics and for playing a certain instrument or being involved in a club. So you can get scholarships for a whole host of things, and it doesn't have to do with financial need. So those are the two big categories of financial aid that's important to know about: gift aid and self-help aid. And when you are applying to different institutions, different post-secondary options, you want to be looking to see how that school is going to package you. So are they going to give you a lot of that gift aid? And if so, that's probably a good thing. That's probably indicative that that's a very good financial aid offer. Or are they giving you more of that self-help aid, where they're saying, yeah, you're going to have to take out a lot of loans or federal work study, or you're going to have to use federal work study? If that's the case, that might be indicative of not as great of a financial aid offer. So it's important to know those two big types, and remember the type that we're striving for all students to be, searching for is that gift aid, because again, once you're awarded that aid, you've done your work, and you don't have to pay that back. So those are the two main categories of financial aid. Then it's also important to know the different sources. So where does financial aid coming from? Who is paying out this gift aid or the self-help aid? Where am I actually going to get that from? There are four main sources that you should know about for financial aid. So we have the federal government, which is the U.S. Department of Education. So that is the biggest awarder of financial aid within the country. Then we have the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. So if you are an Illinois resident, if you're living within Illinois, ISAC is our state agency for financial aid. So we award the state aid at ISAC. Then you have every single college and university, they have their own pool of institutional aid. So each institution is going to have a different amount of institutional aid that they have to give to students. And with institutional aid, they can award this to students however they see fit based off their institutional policies and kind of the regulations that they have in place at their school. And then the last bucket is kind of your outside and your private sources of financial aid. So this is basically financial aid that is coming from every other source than the state, federal, or the institution. This is like the catch-all category. So with outside and your outside and your private sources of financial aid, this is things like, think if you won the local Rotary Club scholarship. This is any types of financial aid that comes from companies or organizations or small businesses. So this is your financial aid that's going to come from those outside additional sources that aren't the state or the federal government or the institution themselves. As a student, the best way to get the most bang for your buck when applying for financial aid is to make sure that you are dipping into all the sources that you are eligible to dip into. So in order within the state of Illinois, if you are either a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen as a student, you would be eligible then for federal aid. You would be eligible for federal student aid, which is from the U.S. Department of Education, and state aid. So the way that you would apply for that is by completing the FAFSA. So if you're a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen, if you complete the free application for federal student aid, that is your way of dipping into both the state and the federal source of financial aid. However, if you are a student that is not a U.S. citizen, or if you are a student that is that was denied federal student aid eligibility because you did not meet the selective service requirement, because you're a transgender student and you did not meet the selective service requirement, you could potentially be eligible for state aid in Illinois. We have passed the RISE Act piece of legislation, went into effect this past January 1st of 2020, which makes state aid available to non-U.S. citizens that meet certain requirements and to transgender students that did not meet the selective service requirement. So to figure out whether or not you would be eligible for that aid if you are a non-U.S. citizen, you can go to ISAC's website, and we have the alternative application for Illinois financial aid. There's some pre-screening questions in there, so you'd be able to see whether or not you would qualify potentially for to be eligible for state aid, even though you're not eligible for federal aid. So for those students, instead of completing a FAFSA, they would be completing the alternative application for Illinois financial aid instead. And then in order to apply for institutional aid, there's a couple of things you have to do. First, you have to apply to the institution. So when you are making your list and figuring out, the schools that you want to apply to, keep in mind every single school has their own pool of institutional aid. So you have to complete the, initial admissions application into the institution. And then once you do that, the way that it works is some schools will say, you know what, all you have to do is complete the application. And then we're going to take your application and we're going to run it against the different, financial aid opportunities we have for students. And if there are any ones that your application matches up with, we will then, give you that type of financial aid. So that's one way schools can do it. But a lot of times schools will say, well, yeah, you have to apply. But then we also have an additional pool of financial aid that requires separate applications. So you want to make sure when you do apply to your institutions that you're looking to see, do they have additional scholarships or financial aid programs that I can apply to that require a separate application? Because sometimes some schools will have them specifically for what your major is, or sometimes schools will have them if you are a legacy student, meaning, you had parents that went there or siblings that went there before. And then sometimes schools will have additional need-based financial aid that you may qualify for. So it all just depends on the specific institution, but you need to make sure that you are checking with your institution to figure out, hey, if you do have additional, institutional aid that may be available for me, what is the process? How do I take advantage of that? And then the last thing is those outside and private sources. So typically what I'll see a lot of students do is they'll do a really good job. They'll either complete the FAFSA or they'll complete the alternative application. and then they'll complete the college application and look for, the institutional aid at the school, and then they stop. I highly recommend that you keep going and you look for those outside and private sources as well, because that is a huge untapped resource for financial aid for school that a lot of students just overlook, because they've already, once they've already turned to the Department of Ed and the state government and the institution, they think they've completely tapped out all of the sources that aid can come from. But remember, those outside and private sources, there are tons and tons and tons of them. And I would highly recommend, when you are considering applying for, whatever outside aid that you can, start local. Look within your community. Look at businesses or organizations within your community that you either, shop at or you have some type of connection with, and see if they offer any type of scholarship opportunities. A lot of times, like churches and community-based organizations like Rotary clubs and the VA, things like that, will have these smaller scholarships that are intended for students that are local. So the cool thing about those is if you are applying to scholarships that are within your community, they tend to be local, which means they tend to award those just to students that are, a part of the community. That being said, with these scholarships, the competition pool is so much smaller than if you are applying to, the Bill Gates scholarship or the McDonald's scholarship, because those are huge national scholarships that a ton of different students are going to be applying for. So the odds of you actually getting awarded those scholarships are a lot smaller than if you were to look at these local scholarships. Additionally, I would also encourage students, when you're looking at those outside and private scholarships, don't be dissuaded by scholarships that you think might be small. A lot of times I'll see students that are like, oh, no, I'm not going to apply to that one because it's only for $500 or it's only for $1,000. In college, $500 or $1,000 is a ton of money, especially if that's, money that you would otherwise have to take out in a loan and have to make payments on, and then you would be having to pay interest on that. That $1,000 can be a big game changer. So I highly, highly recommend that students are applying, even if the scholarship seems small, apply to it. Because a lot of times other students will not apply to scholarships that they think are too small, because because they think, it's not worth my time. So the competition pool gets even smaller for the scholarships that tend to be smaller. So there's a much bigger chance of you actually getting awarded those. So just keep that in mind when you're looking for financial aid and the different types of aid. So as I had mentioned before, the application that you are going to want to be aware of going into your senior year is the free application for federal student aid. So this is so that you can apply for any aid from the Department of Education, so you can see what aid you're going to be eligible for from the federal government. But additionally, you can also see what aid you're going to be eligible for from the state government. So it's looking to see whether or not you have financial need and would qualify for some of those need-based grants. Here in Illinois, the big need-based grant that we have is the Monetary Award Program grant, or the MAP grant. And the reason we tell people complete your FAFSA as soon as possible after October 1st, or complete the alternative application as soon as possible after October 1st, is because that grant is based off of appropriations, which means every year there's a budgeted amount that gets set aside for that. And once enough students complete their FAFSA or their alternative application that are eligible to receive those funds are going to run out. And once those run out, students that, otherwise might have qualified won't be able to receive those funds, because there's just no more money left to give out to students. So that is why we always say complete your FAFSA as soon as possible after October 1st, to ensure that if you are eligible to receive those funds, you are completing your application in time so that you could, the money is still there for you to receive it if you are eligible to receive it. As I had mentioned before, the senior year timeline can be really tight because you have to start applying to your schools. A lot of schools have November 1st deadlines. Some schools even have deadlines as early as, mid-October for when the college applications are due. So it really helps too, junior year, if you can start coming up with a list of schools that you would like to apply to. If you do this in your junior year, this is going to be really beneficial, because essentially you are laying the groundwork for where you are going to spend your time senior year. So if, during my junior year, I've done a really good job researching different schools that offer, majors that I'm kind of interested in, and that have the atmosphere that I'm looking for, and that are close enough or far enough from home for me, where I can, if I want to live at home, I can commute, or if I want to live in the dorms, they have dorm options. So if I've done a really good job researching the schools that are going to kind of check off all of the things that I want in an institution, and I can put a list together of schools that I want to apply to in my junior year, it's going to help me tremendously going into senior year. Because then once I go into senior year, I can look at my list and I can say, okay, let me see what are the application deadlines for these 5 schools that I'm interested in applying to. And I can put them in order of application deadline. So I can say, okay, this November 1st, I have 2 schools that have a November 1st deadline. I've got 1 school that has a November 15th deadline, and then the other 2 are rolling admissions. And that means I can apply at any time. So that would be the order at which I would attack those applications, because I would make sure that I'm getting the ones that, the deadline is coming up the quickest. I would be completing those ones. So it really, really does help if you can take the time and you can come up with that list of schools that you're interested in applying to in your junior year. I recommend, and there is no perfect number. A lot of times students ask, well, how many colleges should I apply to? I was pretty sure about what I wanted. And I was pretty sure that I wanted to stay close to home, and that I wanted to do my first 2 years at my community college. So I applied to my community college and 2 other schools. I still applied to 2 other schools just in case I decided, towards the end of my senior year that no, actually I do want to go away. In case I decided that, I wanted to have some options for places that I could go. But I was pretty sure in the beginning of my senior year that I was going to end up going to my local community college. So I only applied to 3 schools. However, I had some friends that applied to, 6 schools because they knew that they were kind of contemplating schools that were all across the board, and they weren't really sure what their major was. So they were looking at different schools. Just keep in mind that when you are thinking about schools that you want to apply to, the more thoroughly you can get a feel for the school, the better. And I know that right now it's really challenging. If there are junior students that are watching this right now, I'm sure it's, frustrating, because maybe this would have been a time when you would have done some college visits. However, keep in mind, you can utilize virtual visits where you're able to go online, and they've gotten pretty good now where you're able to explore the campus virtually. So that is a way to kind of look through and to get a better feel of what the campus is going to be like. Additionally, talking to students that attend that school is huge. It's always super beneficial to get, input from people that are actual students there, because a lot of times the students that are, just willing to talk to you candidly, they're going to tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's what you want to know when going into a school. You don't just want to see the promo videos where you have, the extremely happy students that are telling you how much they love their experience, because that's, of course, what they're going to say in a promotional video. You want to talk to, actual students that are just going about their day-to-day at that school and see how they are liking that institution. So I highly recommend that you create a list of schools that you want to apply to. Think of size. If you think your high school is absolutely tiny and you're like, I cannot stand it, I want to go to a much bigger school, think of colleges that, might be bigger. If you attend a big high school, there are some colleges that are pretty similar in size to the size of high school. So some colleges can get very small. Other ones, if you're looking at Big 10 schools, those are huge. And that's if, you're in your freshman lecture hall, you're going to be there with another 500 students. So just knowing, what your best learning style is, the size of the school that you want, do they offer the major that you're looking for? Do they offer the extracurriculars? And again, is this in a location that I would be happy with? So if I'm a super urban person and I always wanted to live in a city, is my school close to a city, or is it off in the cornfields where I would be, very unhappy? So just think about that when you are putting that list together. But again, in junior year, that is the time to come up with the schools that you want to apply to. So then once you go into your senior year, you at least have the schools that you want to apply to, and you can figure out right out of the gate, okay, which schools am I going to apply to first? So then getting back to the financial aid piece of it, as I had said before, when you are considering the first thing that is probably going to come up for you in senior year is going to be completing the FAFSA or the alternative application if you're eligible to complete that, because that releases on October 1st. And that is going to be how you would tap into the FAFSAs, how you would tap into the federal and the state sources of financial aid. And then the alternative application is just tapping into the state source of financial aid. But that typically is the first kind of financial aid thing that is going to happen for you in senior year. So it's important to understand what is needed to complete your FAFSA or your alternative application. The nice thing, you're going to hear me referring back and forth to FAFSA or alternative application. Remember, if you are a student who is a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen, the FAFSA is likely going to be the way that you are applying. If you are a student that is a non-U.S. citizen, but you meet those RISE Act eligibility criteria, the alternative application is going to be your way of applying for state aid. So just keep that in mind. But with both of the applications, the nice thing about it is they are, the alternative application is patterned after the FAFSA. So the questions almost mirror each other. So the information that you are going to need for both applications is the same. With the FAFSA, what it is going to ask for, and with the alternative application, what it is going to look at is the student's family's financial situation to determine their expected ability to pay for their first year of college. So this is how schools are going to determine, and this is how the state and federal government are going to determine whether or not the student qualifies for any of that need-based aid, because they're going to ask them to report the financials, and they're going to figure out whether or not there's some financial need there. And if there is, that student may qualify then for some of that need-based aid. So when you are completing the FAFSA or the alternative application, there's a couple of things that's really important for students to know. One is the majority of students under the age of 24 are going to be considered dependent students and are going to also have to provide their parental information on the FAFSA or the alternative application. So again, there are certain instances in where a student could be considered independent and would only need to provide their information, and if the student was married, their spouse's information. But in the majority of cases, if you're a student who is under 24 years old, you are going to have to provide student information and your parents' information. The information you're going to need to be providing on the FAFSA is going to be your tax information. Now, depending on the year of the FAFSA that you're applying for, if you were, filling out the current FAFSA right now, which is the FAFSA for the upcoming 2020-2021 school year, you would be providing your 2018 tax information on that FAFSA. So the student would have to provide that information as well as the parent. So if student or parent filed taxes, they would have to provide that tax information. Additionally, they have to provide information about assets and any cash checkings or savings that student and parent has. In addition to that, it's really important too that the student understands who is considered a parent for purposes of the FAFSA or for purposes of the alternative application. The only people that can be listed in that parent section is a biological parent, an adoptive parent, or a step parent if they are married to your biological parent. So it's really important if the student's in a situation where they have foster parents or if they are under, court-appointed legal guardianship, those people would not be able to be listed in the parent section. However, that student is likely going to qualify as an independent student and wouldn't need to provide parental information in the first place. So just keep that in mind. You can't just list the person that you are living with in the parent section. It actually has to be a biological, adoptive, or a step parent. In the case of a divorce situation, if, my parents are divorced and I lived with my mom during the weekdays, and then I lived with my dad on the weekends, the person's information that I would be required to report on my FAFSA would be my mom's, because within the past 12 months, I spent the majority of the year living with my mom. So keep that in mind. In divorce situations, the student needs to be reporting the parent with whom they have lived the most in the past 12 months. That is the parent whose information then would get reported on the FAFSA. The other parent's information would not be included on the FAFSA. So that's really important to know as well, because I know that's a common situation and a lot of students can think, oh shoot, who do I list if they're divorced or if my parents are divorced or separated? Do I have to list both? Am I only listing one? So that can be really helpful for students, just knowing whose information needs to go on the FAFSA. Additionally, something else to know about the FAFSA or the alternative application is I know a lot of times students get really nervous about this, and I think parents tend to get very nervous about it too, just because you're reporting financial information, and if you're completing the FAFSA, it's a federal form, and you want to be sure that you're doing it accurately. The good thing to know is there is help available for you. So if, when you are in your senior year and October 1st rolls around and okay, hey, the FAFSA and the alternative application has been released, I want to complete it as soon as possible. We have ISAC core members that work within the community college districts, all scattered throughout Illinois, that are available to help free of charge with FAFSAs. These people are trained they go through a 6-week summer training in depth on the FAFSA so that they are able to go then into the communities and help students and parents with completing the FAFSA. Additionally, think of if you have a college counselor or a post-secondary coach within the school, they can be an excellent resource for helping you to complete the FAFSA or the alternative application. Additionally, a good thing to know too is that you should never be paying anybody to help you complete your FAFSA or your alternative application. Again, you have, the ISAC Corps who work for ISAC that are trained, and they're free, a free state resource to help students and parents free of charge with completing the FAFSA. And then you have the people within your school that have also been trained. So, your counselors, your post-secondary coaches that have also been trained and are able to help you. So just make sure that you are never paying anybody for assistance with completing your FAFSA or your alternative application, because you do have free resources that are available to you. Something else that's very good to know, I've had it before where parents approach me and they're, I've taken the day off of work so I can get the FAFSA completed. And keep in mind, while it is a federal form and the first time you go through it, it tends to take a little bit longer than when you're going through it in subsequent years. It typically only takes, even for first-time applicants, like anywhere between 50 minutes to an hour and 15. So it is not something that you need to request a day off of work for. You just need to make sure that you have the documents that you're going to need. So you have the financial information available. If you filed taxes, you have the taxes that you're going to need on hand. And you're just able to, access that information. Additionally, the student's going to need their social security number. And if they are an eligible non-citizen, they'll need their alien registration number as well when they're completing the FAFSA. So you want to know where that is. But it really doesn't take a ton of time to complete it. It's just a matter of working yourself through the application. And again, the first time you do it is always the most daunting. But then after that, it gets much easier in subsequent years. Which brings me to my next point. Something else that's good to know is the FAFSA is something, and the alternative application is something that you would need to complete for every year that you are going to be in college. And the reason being is because this is used, remember, the FAFSA and the alternative application is used to determine a student's eligibility for that need-based aid, to see whether or not they have financial need to qualify for those grants. So that is something, a student's financial need can change from year to year. You might have a year where parents are doing really well and the student doesn't qualify for, need-based aid. The student's been working, they don't qualify for anything, but then the subsequent year, maybe parents were laid off. And in that case, then maybe that student would qualify for need-based grants in that subsequent year. So just keep in mind, it is something that you have to renew every single year. And the FAFSA, if you're completing the FAFSA, it's not just to determine, those need-based grants, but you also have to have a FAFSA on file if you want to receive loans from the Department of Education as well. So just keeping that in mind, sometimes I'll get students or their parents that ask, hey, if I don't think we have, financial need and we're not going to qualify for these grants, should I even bother completing a FAFSA, or should I bother completing the alternative application? The answer is yes. And the reason being because, again, if you're completing the FAFSA, you have to, or if you, in order to take out loans from the Department of Education, you have to complete a FAFSA. So if the student wanted to take out loans from the Department of Ed, they would need a FAFSA on file. Additionally, a lot of institutions say that, we want the student to have either the FAFSA or the alternative application on file before we'll give them any of our institutional aid. Because if you think about it from the college's perspective, they want to see that their students are, if they're eligible, have been tapping into the state and the federal sources of financial aid before they dip into their own pockets to offer the student aid. So a lot of institutions say, hey, if you want to be considered for institutional aid, you're also going to have to make sure that you have a FAFSA or an alternative application on file. So even if you don't think you're going to qualify for those need-based grants through the Department of Ed or through ISAC, you should still be completing a FAFSA. Additionally, I think the last thing that I want to hit on with this is just your junior year timeline. Something I think that is extremely important in junior year is to have the conversation with your parents about financial aid, because a lot of times I think students just assume that, oh, hey, my parents are going to help me this much for college, or that, maybe my parents don't have any money or aren't going to be able to contribute at all to my college expenses. And students just tend to make that assumption without actually having that conversation with their parents. So junior year can be a really beneficial time for students to sit down with their parents and say, hey, these are the schools that I'm considering applying to. I don't know yet, and you will never know until you receive the financial aid offer, which is going to be towards the spring of your senior year, how that school is going to attempt to meet your financial need. So I will say never rule out applying to a school based off of the cost of attendance of that institution, because the cost of attendance is nowhere near indicative of the price that you would actually pay. You have to wait until you get your financial aid offer to see exactly how that school would attempt to meet your financial need. And then once you get that financial aid offer, that's a fair time to rule out schools based off of finances, but not before then. So in your junior year, you should not be ruling out applying to schools just because you see a sticker price or a cost of attendance, because that is not the price that you are necessarily going to pay. You have to wait till you see your financial aid offer to see how that school is going to meet your specific need. So having that conversation with parents, showing them the list of schools you're considering, and talking about, hey, I was thinking that, or do you guys have any college savings for me? If there aren't any college savings for me, this is my plan, or this is how I think that I'm going to be able to come up with some. So just having that conversation early on can be really beneficial, because a lot of times I'll see students that won't say anything to their parents until, they're getting their financial aid offers back in their senior year, and the student might be set on a certain school. And then the parents say, absolutely not. You can't, live that far away from home, or whatever the case may be. So you want to make sure that you're having those conversations very early on with your parents, because the sooner that you loop them in and the sooner you get that back and forth communication going, the smoother the process is going to go. And it's just going to be easier, because they're going to be on board, and they're going to be understanding kind of what is happening as it's happening, instead of just being bombarded in senior year saying, hey, this is what I'm doing and I have to make a decision tomorrow. So just keep that in mind. Loop parents in, and junior year is a great time to do it. I would say earlier too, start having those conversations as early as possible. Freshman, sophomore year can be a great time as well. But yeah, so in a nutshell, again, this was geared towards our juniors, and kind of the timeline for what you should be thinking about in junior year to prepare yourself for everything that's going to be going on for you senior year. Hopefully this was helpful. Thank you to all of those that joined. Thank you, Pat, for joining. If anybody has any additional questions, I'll be looking at the comment section after this. But thank you all, and we will see you again next Tuesday.